Hi, I'm Katy Ward. I have with me today the person that I've learned the most about health from by far of anyone I've ever seen or met, including all of my doctors. This is Dande Ward. He is a lifestyle medicine coach based in Atlanta, Georgia. And as we talk about these topics of like fight or flight and rest and digest and toxic productivity culture, and also how it's possible to get a lot done and still stay in a peaceful state, there's no one I can think of who's taught me more about how my brain works and all of those topics than Dande. Hi, Dande.
Hello.
Also, Dandy's my brother. If you know me at all, you've heard me talk about him a lot. Anything else you want to say about who you are and being my
Oh,
brother?
no, that was a pretty fantastic introduction. Um, I guess what I will do is briefly introduce what lifestyle medicine is. I think it's a term that people don't really understand.
Yeah.
So, lifestyle medicine is the parts of health and well-being that are not involved in diagnosis and prescription. So everything from hydration, nutrition, sleep, movement, mindfulness and mentality, self-care habits, community as medicine, play as medicine, those kind of topics. So I specialize in doing habit formation and helping people build their lives around the different parts of health and health habits that their doctors aren't involved in.
Yeah, and it seems like the reason there's such a need for that is that our medical culture is so like if you have any kind of problems, you should be able to just take a pill for it and then it goes away, versus understanding your body and building your life around feeling good, which seems logical, but to most, especially Americans, is really not logical. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the people that I spend a lot of time around are people who want to build their own life kind of in every area. They tend to be a little more ambitious. They tend to be creative. We have this inner inspiration and pressure to bring, all of our gifts into the world and all of our ideas into the world. So talking about the struggle to rest and where that comes from and what it actually does to our nervous system.
Well, let's start with how I define rest.
Okay.
There's a difference between sleep or relaxation and rest.
Mhm.
Rest is a state in which the body is functioning optimally. It is spending the energy it has and not energy over that. Periods of rest are really necessary for our function because all the other periods are either us recharging or us overspending our resources. Rest is a neutral state in which you can be productive, you can be working, you can be living. All that rest means is that your energy and your energy out are equal.
Yeah,
So
that's different. Most people think of rest as I'm sleeping or I'm sitting, not doing very much, versus rest can be a constant state. Even when you're outputting a lot of effort, you can still be in a rest state. That's different.
yeah. The other thing, a lot of people equate dissociative states with rest states. There's a lot of different types of dissociative states, and they are not restful to your brain. Your brain shutting down in certain ways because it's either overstimulated or doesn't have the resources it needs. It's not a rest or a recharge state. It's a dissociative state, which is more aligned with fight or flight pathways or sympathetic pathways a lot of the time. Not always, but often.
So some examples of that are we immediately reach for our phones and we start scrolling. Disassociation also would be video games or TV, or is it just escapism? Is it distinct from escapism?
It is distinct from escapism. So TV and video games are not always inherently dissociative.
Okay.
Being actively engaged in something you're interested in is not a dissociative state. Flipping through channels and not absorbing anything, that's when it becomes a dissociative state. Same with if you're on your phone and you're actively messaging someone, you're having a conversation, or you're doing something that is engaging, great. But where it's dissociation is when you're just scrolling and you feel like you can't stop.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain jumps towards it.
So why do people think that is rest? Why does it get confused?
We've been trained to believe it is. All of the things that we've been given over the past 30 years have all been dissociative habits. Everything on our phone is built to get you into a dissociative habit because it keeps you there, right? real rest requires community and it requires contentment. And contentment is antithetical to buying things and unhappiness for consumerism. And so dissociative states actually work way better for a consumerist culture than like contented rest states where you don't feel like you need anything necessarily. Yeah. I also think, we're in a place where we don't really have many third spaces left outside of bars. There are definitely still parks and recreational activities, but they aren't used in nearly the same way they were. And so the spaces we rest in are also a lot more condensed. For a lot of people, their rest space is their house. They work. Either they work in the home, which kind of disrupts that rest space, or they get home and just crash because they're so tired, and that's still not restful.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about this whole self-care movement and how it's different than rest and how a lot of the time it also feels like productivity. And where does that and why has that come in with disassociation in the culture that we have? Do you see what I mean?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So self-care culture, self-care is different from everybody. Everyone has different kinds of self-care. When you bring influencing into it and you're told this is how you should self-care, all of a sudden it becomes steps. It becomes, here are the steps in order I don't have to do. And the biggest metric for is this restful or not is if there's any shame attached to it. If there are any habits that you're like, oh, I'm resting, but if I don't do this perfectly, I'm going to feel embarrassed or ashamed, it's probably not actually a rest state. Right?
Yeah, that's great if there's any shame attached to it.
This self-care culture that we've been building is, again, it's built around products, it's built around habits, it's built around what you should or should not eat, how much you should sleep, how much you should. And in truth, rest states are a state where you don't have to think about it. You can just flow through habits.
Mm-hmm. The flow thing, there's disassociation, rest, activity. What about flow states?
So for a lot of people who don't know how to enter rest states, the closest they get is flow states. Flow states are adjacent to dissociative states. They're just involved in activity. So a flow state really captures all of your mind. A flow state's kind of like a form of meditation where it really captures parts of the mind and gets in this hyper-focused state. Mm-hmm. So whether you're making art or dancing or working out or whatever it is, getting into a flow state means your brain is entirely focused on this activity. Mm-hmm. It is a dopamine-based process. It is also an exhaustive-based process. Flow states are amazing. They feel really good. They use an enormous amount of energy.
What exactly does that mean? A dopamine-based or exhaustive-based?
So the people who are going to understand this the quickest are going to be our neurodivergent friends, because neurodivergent people slip into flow state easier and also for longer. But for anyone who's not, they've also experienced these periods where you are painting or drawing and you get really into it. And then all of a sudden you look at the clock and realize you haven't drank any water or gone to the restroom in like 4 hours. And your back hurts and your neck hurts and you had no idea because you were in flow state, right? So it's that hyper focus. It's using an extraordinary amount of energy in the brain. There's an increase in ATP. There's an increase. I don't think we have a ton of flow state research. It's very hard to MRI someone in a flow state. But we know we have the research around play. We have the research around other kind of similar states. And it is an elevated energy usage of the brain and the body.
Mm-hmm. But the flow state crowds out some of those like stressful things, I suppose, that feel unrestful. So your body's telling you like, ooh, I'm in fight or flight. I'm anxious. I'm nervous. I feel stressed. You go into not a rest state. You go into a flow state and your mind kind of crowds all that stuff out. So it feels stressful.
Well, the big thing is after a flow state, usually there's some sort of crash state, depending on how intense the flow state was. You are more tired afterwards and you enjoy it. There's a lot of dopamine. There's a lot of happy neurochemicals, right? But it's exhaustive. And so for a lot of people that don't have a lot of experience in rest, flow is the closest they get because it feels like dissociation where you're not dealing with the things you don't want to deal with, but it feels positive.
Yeah, and it feels productive. Right. And there's this productivity thing. That's what I want to talk about next is the reason fight or flight and rest and digest has become such a prevalent conversation. We're not getting chased around by tigers. So our brains are relating stress to a lot more things than are actually endangering our bodies. The idea that we're not being chased by tigers, but we still get stressed all the time. Everybody's heard that story. I was in a car wreck with a red truck a long time ago, and now still, every time I see a red truck, a little bit of me tenses up.
Also known as trauma responses, generally.
Yeah. Okay, so they're previous trauma responses that tell us there's all this trouble in our environment that creates continued stress unless we have a way to release and clean out those stresses. My meditation practice actually does that. And we have all this like hypersensitivity to collecting stress that's not actually endangering our life, which means anything that seems like it endanger our security or our ego starts to turn into stresses that put us into a fight or flight state, which means we're getting those signals all the time. And the amount of input in our brain with the amount of media that we see, and take somebody who was a village dweller from hundreds of years ago and put them in our society now, and their brain would probably be fried by the end of one day, just completely overwhelmed. So this is the overloaded state of our brains. Yeah.
What's take that analogy you just said, I think a person from the past and the present would actually do better than a person from the present to the past. And this goes to what you're talking about, is sensitization, right?
Okay.
So whether it's our dopamine sensory neurons, our dopamine receptors, right? They change sensitivities depending on activity. If you do a lot of activity, we see this in like drug addiction. The more you need more drug to get to the point because dopamine receptors lose sensitivity. Well, our entire culture is built around convenience currently. And never before, ever in any animal on the planet has had such convenience as we have, and we keep finding more ways to be more convenient. And while that mostly seems like a good thing, we're getting more and more research on how our biological mechanisms are suffering because of that. One of the big instances, most people now are living in consistent temperatures throughout the day. And part of our circadian rhythms are actually controlled by changes in temperature throughout the day, as well as changes in light, which we're also in consistent lighting. It's convenient for us, but our body was not built for it. And so now all of a sudden, we're seeing in some studies that people are way more sensitive to hot and cold and its effect on their mood, on their productivity, on all these things because we've desensitized. Mm-hmm. If you've ever been in a Korean spa with Canadians, they'll sit in an ice bath for an hour. And I live in the South and I'll dip a toe in and squeal for 5 minutes.
Yeah. Me too.
So our bodies learn to adjust to the surroundings we're in. And the more that we are shrinking the range of what we feel is comfortable, the more we're growing the range of what we see as dangerous.
That's okay. Yeah, that makes sense, which is yet another thing that puts us in this like fight or flight mode and unable to rest. The other part of this fight or flight mode, the productivity thing, how much value we're placing on productivity and how it's gotten collapsed with our identity. Let's talk about hyperproductivity and toxic productivity. Where that starts, that I've really started to notice, I want to go back in my story a little bit. I started my copy business when I was like 25. And at the time I was in San Diego, I had this amazing community of entrepreneurs around me. Most of them were older than me. Most of them had accomplished a lot already. And, you know, because I was around those people, I got exposed to hustle culture. And not all of them were that way. Like I was in San Diego, so there was a lot more balance. Hearing about the Gary V's and the Twitter culture, there was so much emphasis on the only way to be successful when the tools are available to everyone is to outwork everyone else. And I, you know, like both of us, I had limitations with chronic symptoms and I had limitations in my energy, and I was really struggling with anxiety at the time. And I really had to modulate my mood and my nervous system to have good blocks of time that were highly functional, right? Otherwise I would just freeze. I kind of was forced to figure out how to balance rest and productivity a lot because of the symptoms I would experience. And I would still get really focused and feel really pressured to produce a lot. And you saw me burn out. And I think it was you. You were the first person who were like, do you recognize that this is like the third or fourth cycle of your hyperproductivity, which is amazing, woo, and then you just crash? And I was like, no, really? You know, like it took me a while to figure it out. So with that context of like, you and I had to learn how to not just do the hyperproductivity thing. And we had to learn how to uncollapse the identity from the output. What about you? What has your experience with hyperproductivity been for yourself?
My journey with hyperproductivity, I've always been on the kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. I have bursts of hyperproductivity, but more frustration that I've kind of been barred in many ways from that state. I have narcolepsy, and it has pretty dramatic effects on my neurochemistry. And so I have to be in rest state.
Mhm.
Anytime I'm expending more energy than I have, it causes crashes that can last a while. And so I've watched a lot of other people be in this hyperproductive state and strive towards it and burn out before I even get there.
Yeah, yeah.
And then what I had to learn was how to be in the middle to function optimally to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And and my other end that I fall into is kind of the more like anti-productive states. So that rest and state where I'm productive and feel good, but also just using what I have is just it's where I've kind of learned to live. As for where hyperproductivity comes from, this comes back to one of the lifestyle medicine principles is as community is medicine, right? When you live in a community mindset, what you care most about is how you're showing up and who you are to your community, your role in your relationships. The best examples of how this works really well is when we look at blue zone data. So blue zones are the areas of the world where people regularly live over 100. And we've done an enormous amount of health research on what all these areas have in common. There's a couple nutrition things, but the nutrition actually doesn't have as much in common. The one thing that they all have in common is that they're really tight-knit community-based structures where people's identity are more based in how they show up for their community than in what they're doing or producing. It's I have a role I fulfill for my community, and that's what gives me joy.
Mhm.
Well, unfortunately,
cultures are less focused on the work part, and they're more focused on, like regularly seeing the people in their life. They finish work and then they have lunch with their friends and they have dinner with their family and they, bring their kids around their friends and keep going. Yeah, those things.
Yeah. Well, and they're not concerned about building well. They're concerned about living well with each other, and they have some of the happiest index scores on the planet because that's what they're focusing on. Because happiness and productivity have nothing to do with each other at all. Being productive can cause moments of happiness like, oh yeah, I'm rewarding myself. That's a dopamine signaling, but that's a reward system. Real parasocial happiness, that's a serotonin process. And they're different feelings. There's different types of happiness, right? So
with those like different types of happiness, it seems like here in the States, the idea of having a productive day, what is it about I got to the end of the day and wow, I got so much done that there's a feeling to that and we think of that as being happy? Do we even have access to the sense of happiness, or have we just been so trained?
Even through the way we're schooled and just a lot of the ways that we've been kind of taught. But even when you look at American culture for European culture, Europe does not care about work nearly as much as America does. And this comes up all the time that Americans are way more dedicated because there's not a culture in Europe that says focus towards hustle. America's culture is based on this American dream of rising to the top, right? Where there is rising and there's this pressure to rise. Mm-hmm. And we've equated rising with morals, in which the best people are going to rise to the top. And therefore, in order to be good, it's all tied to productivity.
Yeah.
But more than that, what's tied to is competition. It's tied to, I have to get ahead of everyone else. That is antithetical to the community mindset.
Yeah.
You cannot be focused and present with how you show up for community and trying to get ahead of them. And this is something I've warred with quite a bit of, even feelings of, comparing my income to my friend's income actively in my head, while also like being present and enjoying and thinking about how I can show up for my community and realizing how much that doesn't matter. And like, why is this something that I've been trained to compare? And so instead, just like shifting that focus to who am I in my community? Who am I with my friends? How do I support them? How do they support me? How are we happy together? And just exploring those forms of social happiness. And that for me is what generates rest state. So we'll get to like what causes rest state for us later, but like that's a big one of mine.
I spent some time in Europe in May, and I did get to be around a bunch of expats who had their own businesses, which is amazing. And one of the things that they said was that there, and especially some there were a couple of British people that I talked to recently that were really complaining about this. If you rise, if you start to achieve more, if you start to really shine in your gifts, the culture is more to pull you down. The point, like, we're not just going to go become a baker and forget about all of our dreams so that we can live a blue zone life. The point is we want to be able to pursue and express and build and contribute in really big ways while staying in a rest state.
Yes.
That's what's possible.
Let's start there with the inability to rest.
Okay.
We talked before about that shrinking margin of comfortability.
Mm-hmm.
The more and more that you're steeped in hyperproductivity culture, the more and more your brain is built around, if I am not doing an activity, I'm not good, which creates danger signaling. Danger signaling can trigger fight or flight responses regularly. That danger signaling is what stops people from being able to enter rest state. They're in a productivity space. They're in that space where their brain is mapping out everything instead of just being able to exist in a space.
Yeah.
We've all been on vacation with someone who's like planned every moment of it because the idea of just chilling is foreign. They just don't, they have trouble doing it.
Say you finish work, you have like a dead hour, and you could sit there and do something you really enjoy or do nothing. But what comes into the mind is this stack of other things that would be productive to do, or how dare you sit and rest? You haven't done all of these things. Or if that's too uncomfortable, then the brain goes to, okay, well, at least I need to distract or disassociate so that I'm not thinking about my to-do list. And then an hour's pass and you've just been scrolling, right? So it's like an inability to rest. There's some avoidance there.
Well, and so that's the other piece to rest, is that rest is a present state. Rest is the ability to sit with whatever's happening in your brain and not feel like you want to run away from it. And I think that's what a lot of people experience. They start getting into a rest state, and then their brain starts being like, hey, you need to pay attention to all these brain things. And they either run back into productivity, which is a form of distraction, or into dissociation, which is a form of distraction. And actually being able to rest and what it does for the brain that's so good is involved in this, being able to sit there and be like, oh, here are the things I'm feeling, and just sitting and being present with it without feeling the need to reach for or purchase, or it's not a state of wanting, it's a state of being.
Observing, yeah.
And it's passive. You can practice dipping a toe in it. And for people who aren't used to it, it's very, very uncomfortable. But even think about the old people sitting on a porch, watching people walk by. That's a rest state. Because they are just present. They're just being. Yeah. And that's what rest is.
Like, if you're not used to doing that at all, you said it could feel very uncomfortable. That the sensation would be like you sit down and all of these thoughts come up and tasks, and then eventually emotions start to come up, and the logical part of your brain is like, I'm sitting here doing nothing, like something must be wrong for all of this stuff to be coming up. But it's just, is it your nervous system just offloading all of this extra information in the first space of breath that you've given it attention?
Do you know how I would actually describe what rest states do for the brain? I'm going to use a metaphor. So if your brain's a nightclub, and you're in hyperproductivity space, and there's lasers and lights, and you're jumping and you're dancing and whatever, you enter rest, and it's the end of the night in the club, and the lights come on. Being in a club with the lights on is an uncomfortable thing to do, because there's an awareness of the club that you didn't really want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like,
especially if it's like a grungy, underground, dark, like.
Right. And I'm telling you, everyone watching this, your brain is a grungy, dark, underground space.
Yeah.
There's no avoiding that.
And the rest is the ability to turn the lights on and...
Yeah. And so what happens, there's 1,000 voices in the nightclub, and the lights turn on, and then they slowly start bleeding out. And then you're able to look around and do things like sweep and wipe off the bar, and all of a sudden, that bar is now at rest. It's still being productive. It's still getting clean. It's still a space that's used, but there's an awareness of what's in the space. So rest allows your brain to be aware of what's going on in it. And because we have such a distraction culture and so many ways to not pay attention, the idea of being present in our own brains is uncomfortable. And there's so many, again, because we view it from the lens of hyperproductivity, we're thinking about how good or bad or productive or unproductive are our internal thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so being able to sit with them, and then you're judging good or bad, good or bad, good or bad, good or bad, instead of sitting there and being like, these are just my thoughts.
Yeah, it's weather.
Yeah. And the more you're able to be in that rest state and let them flow, the more they leave. And you quiet down and your brain can actually sort through what you want.
Yeah. The goal isn't to clear your mind of thoughts. That's not a thing, especially like eyes open. You're going to have thoughts, but just like the old person sitting on the porch, like the thoughts are coming in and out and you're thinking about things. Great. And you said being present and at peace with yourself, content with yourself, and not relating to all of those thoughts as either who you are or how you're doing, or if you're worthy or if they're right or wrong. So one of the things we've talked about is like in this rest state, how does the relationship with yourself come up? And say it's not great. If you have a really bad relationship with yourself, can you even rest? Do you think?
I would say no. I would say and the worse your relationship is with you, the more you are to being in one of the 4 active states of fight or flight. And a lot of this, again, is this conditioning shame base of who I am is not good enough, who I am is not whatever enough. And again, that's a hyperproductivity mindset of the self. And so if we're talking about how do you go from I can't sit still with myself for a second to I can fully rest and sit on that porch like that old person and sip an iced Coca-Cola and watch bikers go by, you know? The first step is recognizing the shame you feel and starting to tangle it. Because I think for a lot of people, there's a lot of I'm not good enough feeling for very normal things in their brain. It's an inherent sense that I just know I'm not good enough with no real backing, no real thing that they're comparing it against. And that's the feeling is I'm so terrified that I'm going to sit with myself and learn that I'm not good enough. So I'll just avoid it.
Or that you don't like yourself.
Yeah. I mean, liking and accepting are also different. There are things that you cannot like about yourself and still fully rest. You don't have to be happy and content with every part of yourself. This is not like a well-being, I'm in self-love, so therefore I can rest. It's being neutral about even those parts of yourself that you're like, I'd like to change that, instead of hitting that point and being like, okay, here's what we're doing to work on it. Here's how we're changing this. It's sitting there and looking at it and like letting it pass by and be like, oh, this is a part of me. And that's just the way it is. And there will be a time when I can work on and plan for this state, but it doesn't have to be like I'm acknowledging this. I'm making a footnote and I'm moving on instead of I've run into a spot on the counter. Let me pull out the bleach. Let me pull out the paper towels. Let me pull out the scrubber. Let me pull out all of a sudden you're like sanding your countertop, you know? And that's how people do what they do in their mind is they're present. They find the first thing they don't like and they just get scrubbing.
Yeah.
Which then immediately exits themselves from rest. Sounds a lot like meditation on the surface, I realize, in talking about it. It's not the silent process of sitting there silently and just like letting the thoughts flow like happens in meditation. It's more so just being able to sweep or go on a walk or without the need for music, without the need for those things are all great. But one of the things I've had a couple conversations about up until probably about the 80s, maybe the 70s, we didn't have music everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Even you go back maybe 100 years, music was rare. Music was a rare thing. You had to go to a place to experience music. And we lived far more silent lives. There was not audio everywhere. And what has it done to our brain that we have so much audio stimulation all the time, that we're always absorbing information all the time? Yeah. Again, with that window of discomfort, all of a sudden, walking through the woods and listening to the birds for a lot of people is painful.
Yeah.
They don't know how to do it. And so then all of a sudden their brain is generating that noise because it's not coming externally.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where this practice of sitting in a low information state, basically. I don't have a lot of processing coming in and I'm just outflowing and letting my brain do it. But the big thing in here, it's going to be uncomfortable. Starting this process and learning to rest for those that aren't used to it is uncomfortable. And you've got to sit with the discomfort and teach your brain that discomfort is not danger.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the only thing that allows you to stay in rest state is this is uncomfortable and that's not a bad thing.